Where did all my friends go? I woke up Monday morning to everyone I knew canceling our plans for the week. Parker said he had to fly to Seattle for work, even though he worked at a coffee shop. Claire's mom was suddenly sick, and she had to go home to Michigan. Josh's text just said he'd be out of town for a while, and to not worry about him. I tried calling them, but got voicemail, declined calls, and Josh didn't even have red receipts on anymore. I had a weird feeling, but I tried to shake it off. I still stopped by our usual bar that night, but no one was there. The bartender said I was the first one from my group to come in that day, which made no sense, since Jackson, Kyle, and Eva always came here after work. "Is everything okay?" he asked, and I had to tell him I had no idea. I drove to Jackson's apartment because he hadn't texted me at all. His roommate said Jackson had packed everything and left at 4 a.m. Saturday morning for a family emergency. By Tuesday, I'd confirmed all 14 people in our friend group had left town, every single one, and all their social media went dark the moment they left. I went to the police, but when I mentioned my friends' names, the desk sergeant got this look and asked me to wait. A detective came out asking when I'd last seen each person and whether they'd seemed afraid. "What kind of afraid?" I asked. "You tell me," he said. When I pressed him, he said they'd had similar reports, but couldn't discuss an ongoing investigation. At the coffee shop, the owner said someone had been asking about our group last week, but he couldn't remember who. Wednesday, I found a note under my door. "They left to protect you." My hands were shaking. Protect me from what? Who was leaving me notes? I couldn't eat, couldn't focus at work. My boss asked if I was okay, and I didn't know how to explain that everyone I knew had vanished. Then on Thursday, I got home, and my landlord was waiting for me. I was so desperate for information at that point that I told myself maybe somehow my landlord knew the answer to my missing friends. But instead he said, "I have someone who wants to tour your apartment." I felt shivers go down my spine. "But I'm not moving out," I said. He just gave me this look like he knew something I didn't, and said to leave my apartment unlocked the next day so he could show the next tenants. I bought a deadbolt instead. 2 weeks passed and still no sign of my friends. I started tracking down their relatives and distant friends and just got more and more clues I couldn't piece together. Naomi saw Claire at the airport, but Claire walked past like they'd never met. Tom saw Josh at a rest stop with 3 strangers, and Josh turned away when Tom waved. And then one day, I got a call from an unknown number. "Stop looking for us," she said, and my heart almost stopped. It was Claire. "Where are you? What's happening?" My voice cracked. "I can't explain," she said. "You wouldn't believe me if I could." "Are you in danger?" I said. "We're exactly where we need to be." "Why did everyone leave?" I was almost crying now. "Why just me?" "You know why?" she said. "I don't know anything. Think about what makes you different," she said. "What we all did that you didn't." She hung up. I threw my phone against the wall. I made lists with shaking hands, trying to find what I'd missed. The cabin trip I'd skipped. The concert I was sick for. Harper's escape room party I'd bailed on. At the time, I'd worried they'd be pissed at me for bailing so much. Was that all this was? They'd ghosted me because I was flaky? Or had something happened at one of them? Something that had affected everyone I knew except for me? Saturday, I saw Jackson's car at a motel. I pounded on doors until the manager threatened to call the cops. When I went back to the parking lot, the car was gone. Was I losing my mind? Were they watching me? I stopped going to work, stopped answering my phone, sat in my apartment with all the lights on, waiting for something to happen. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow could be one of them. Sunday night, another note appeared inside my locked apartment. "Stop looking or you'll have to leave too." I tore my apartment apart looking for how they got in, checked every window, every vent, nothing. They could get to me whenever they wanted. I wasn't safe anywhere. I hadn't slept in 3 days. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I'd called in sick to work so many times they'd probably fire me, but I didn't care because what was the point of anything if everyone could just disappear? I was making another list, trying to find patterns in the chaos, when I heard footsteps in the hallway. They stopped at my door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The footsteps moved away down the hall, and I heard a door open and close somewhere on my floor. I sat there frozen until light started coming through my window. My back hurt from sitting against the wall all night, and the kitchen knife was still in my hand. I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't just sit here waiting for something to happen. I pulled out my phone and called the police station. The desk sergeant answered, and I asked for the detective who'd talked to me before about my missing friends. He put me on hold for a minute, and then a different voice came on. Detective Rudy Beck introduced himself and asked what I needed. I told him about the footsteps and the note that appeared inside my locked apartment and how I'd been up all night with a knife. He didn't sound surprised or like he thought I was crazy. He just asked if I could come to the station that afternoon to give a full statement. I said yes, and he told me to bring any notes or evidence I had. I hung up and realized my hands had stopped shaking for the first time in days. I took a shower and changed clothes and tried to eat something, but my stomach was still too tight. I got to the police station around 2 and asked for Beck at the front desk. He came out a few minutes later and led me back to a small room with a table and recording equipment. He was maybe 40 with gray in his hair and tired eyes like he'd seen too much. He started the recorder and asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told him about all 14 friends leaving town with weird excuses. I told him about the notes under my door, and then the one that appeared inside my locked apartment. I told him about my landlord wanting to show my place and demanding I leave it unlocked. Beck wrote everything down and recorded it all, and he didn't look shocked by any of it. That made me feel less crazy, but also way more scared, because clearly, he already knew something about what was happening. When I finished, he turned off the recorder and looked at me for a long moment. He told me not to touch any more notes if they appeared, and to photograph everything with timestamps on my phone. He said there was an active investigation into coordinated activity, but he couldn't share details since I wasn't directly involved yet. I asked him what coordinated activity meant, and he just said he couldn't discuss an ongoing case. I left the station feeling like I had more questions than answers, but at least someone official was taking me seriously now. I stopped at a hardware store on the way home and bought a proper deadbolt kit and a cheap battery-powered door camera. The guy at the counter asked if I was having security problems, and I just nodded. Installing the deadbolt took me almost 2 hours because I'd never done it before and kept stripping the screws. The door camera was easier, and I mounted it up high where someone would need a ladder to mess with it. When I finished, I tested the deadbolt about 20 times and checked the camera feed on my phone. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had some control over who could get into my space. My phone rang while I was putting the tools away, and I almost didn't answer when I saw it was my boss. She asked why I'd missed 3 days without calling in, and I could hear the frustration in her voice. I tried to explain about a family emergency, but I was fumbling over my words and not making much sense. She cut me off and said HR needed to discuss my attendance with me tomorrow morning. I said okay, and she hung up. I sat down on my couch and put my head in my hands. I was going to lose my job on top of everything else. The HR meeting the next morning was awful. I sat across from this woman named Sandra, who had my attendance record printed out in front of her. She asked what was going on, and I tried to explain without sounding paranoid or crazy. I couldn't tell her my friends all vanished and someone was breaking into my apartment. It sounded insane even in my own head. I said I was dealing with some personal issues, and she nodded like she'd heard it all before. She put me on a performance improvement plan and said if I missed any more days without proper notice, I'd be terminated. She also suggested I consider taking a leave of absence if I was dealing with serious personal issues. I left her office feeling embarrassed and angry at myself for letting everything fall apart like this. That evening, I forced myself to go back to our usual bar, even though I knew no one would be there. I needed to be somewhere that felt normal, even if it wasn't anymore. The bartender recognized me right away and came over. He asked how I was doing, and I said I'd been better. He mentioned that the whole group had stopped coming in, and they'd left their shared tab unpaid from 2 weeks ago. I asked if anyone had been by asking about us, and he said no. I ordered a soda and sat at our usual table just staring at the empty chairs. When I got home, I pulled up our old group chats on my laptop. I scrolled back through months of messages looking for anything I'd missed. Most of it was normal stuff about meeting up or complaining about work. But then, around the time of that cabin trip I'd skipped, there was a bunch of excited chatter. Everyone was talking about these bank sign-up bonuses they were doing together. Jackson said he'd already made $300. Claire posted a link to some website. Parker said it was the easiest money he'd ever made. I'd seen those messages back then, but I'd been too busy to pay attention. Now I read through every single one trying to understand what they'd gotten into. The next morning, I was waiting in the building lobby when my landlord came in. Al Rowe was a short guy with a beer gut who always seemed annoyed about something. I stepped in front of him and asked why he'd entered my apartment without permission. He got defensive immediately and said he had the right to show the unit to possible tenants any time. I told him that wasn't legal, and he couldn't just demand I leave my door unlocked. He said I was being difficult and making his job harder. I said I'd installed my own deadbolt, and he wasn't getting in without proper notice. His face got red, and he pushed past me toward the stairs. I spent the rest of that afternoon on my laptop researching tenant rights. I found out Al had broken multiple laws by demanding I leave my door unlocked and entering without 24-hour written notice. I filled out a formal complaint form on the City Tenants Union website and attached documentation of every text and conversation we'd had. When I hit submit, I felt a small bit of satisfaction that at least I was fighting back against something I could actually prove. That evening, I checked my door camera app and almost dropped my phone. The footage showed a guy in a maintenance uniform unlocking my door at 2:30 that afternoon while I was at work. He walked right in like he owned the place and looked around for maybe 5 minutes before leaving. I downloaded the video immediately, and my hands were shaking, so bad I could barely type. I sent copies to Detective Beck and the tenants' union with a message explaining what Al had done. This was actual proof that someone had been entering my apartment without permission. I paced around my living room for an hour, waiting for someone to respond and checking the camera feed every few minutes, like the guy might come back. Around 9 that night, my phone rang with an unknown number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Detective Beck, and he sounded different from before, more careful with his words. He said he'd received my video and would look into it, but then he said something that made my stomach drop. He mentioned the investigation involved coordinated financial activity across state lines, and multiple people were cooperating with authorities. I asked what that meant for my friends, and he got quiet for a second. He told me I should stop trying to contact them because it could interfere with people who were helping investigators. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but he said he couldn't discuss details of an ongoing case, and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to make sense of what coordinated financial activity meant. Were my friends criminals? Were they victims? Why would contacting them interfere with anything? I couldn't sleep, so I opened my laptop and started searching. I typed in bank bonus schemes and fraud, and found myself going down a rabbit hole of articles about account muling. People were opening bank accounts with fake information to collect referral bonuses, and some of them were facing federal charges. The articles talked about recruiters who organized groups of people to do this together, and how the feds were cracking down hard. I kept reading, and my heart was beating faster with every article. Some people got probation if they cooperated, but others went to jail. Around 3 in the morning, a memory hit me so hard I had to stand up and walk around. At that escape room party I'd bailed on early, Ava had been talking about some workshop on stacking bonuses legally. She'd seemed really excited about it, and a bunch of people had been listening. I'd thought it sounded boring and left to go home because I had work the next day. Had that been when they all got recruited into whatever this was? Had I avoided getting caught up in federal fraud charges just because I'd been tired and left early? In the morning, I felt like I hadn't slept at all, but I forced myself to get up and make coffee. I remembered seeing articles by a local reporter named Halima Washington, who wrote investigative pieces about financial crimes. I found her email on the newspaper website and spent an hour writing and rewriting a message. I explained there was a pattern of disappearances possibly connected to financial fraud, but I didn't name anyone. I said I wasn't looking to expose people, just trying to understand what had happened to my friends. I hit send before I could change my mind, and then sat there refreshing my email every 30 seconds. Halima responded within an hour asking for documentation, and I felt this weird mix of relief and fear. I sent her redacted timelines showing when everyone had left, and explained I was trying to piece together what they'd gotten involved in. She wrote back fast with links to public court filings from a nearby county. I clicked through them and saw arrests for bank account fraud and identity theft. Several people were listed as cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. None of the names were people I knew, but the timing matched up with when my friends had disappeared. My weekly check-in with my boss happened that afternoon, and I was dreading it. She asked how I was doing, and I admitted I was struggling but getting help. She offered me a leave of absence, but I said I needed to keep working for my mental health and income. We negotiated, and she agreed to let me work from home 3 days a week with reduced hours. It wasn't perfect, but it gave me flexibility to deal with everything that was happening. The next day, Detective Beck emailed asking me to come in for a follow-up. I drove to the station feeling sick to my stomach and wondering if I was in trouble somehow. Beck met me in the same room as before and started by confirming I wasn't a suspect or target of any investigation. Then he warned me that continuing to investigate on my own could accidentally mess up cases against the actual people who'd broken the law. I asked him directly if my friends were in legal trouble, and he looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said several people were cooperating as witnesses, while others faced potential charges. He couldn't tell me who fell into which category, or give me any names. I left the station feeling more confused than ever because I still didn't know which of my friends were victims and which ones might go to jail. When I got back to my apartment that evening, I saw a folded piece of paper on the floor just inside the door. My hands shook as I picked it up and read the message written in blue ink. The handwriting looked like Claire's neat print with the way she made her letter S. The note just said, "We're sorry, but please stop." I took a photo of it with my phone and added it to the folder on my desktop where I was keeping everything. Then I sat on my couch, staring at those 5 words until they stopped making sense. The next morning, my boss called me into her office, along with someone from HR I'd never met before. They asked me to sit down, and the HR woman said they were worried about my attendance and performance over the past few weeks. I tried to explain that I was dealing with a difficult personal situation, but my voice came out shaky and unconvincing. The HR woman slid a pamphlet across the desk about the Employee Assistance Program and said I could get 6 free therapy sessions through the company's benefits. She wrote down a phone number for a therapist named Connie Sloan who had availability that week. I took the pamphlet even though I didn't think talking to a stranger would help anything. But that afternoon I called the number anyway because I was desperate enough to try anything at that point. The receptionist scheduled me for Thursday at 4 in the afternoon, and I wrote it in my phone calendar. When Thursday came, I almost didn't go, but I forced myself to drive to the office building and take the elevator to the 3rd floor. Connie's waiting room had soft chairs and magazines about gardening. She came out right on time and led me back to her office, which had a couch and tissues on every table. I sat down and started explaining everything in a rush, the disappearances and the notes and my landlord and how I couldn't sleep or focus on anything. Connie listened without interrupting and took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finally stopped talking, she asked me what I thought was the worst thing that could happen. I said my friends were in danger, or I was in danger, or both. She nodded and then asked me to list the actual facts I knew for certain without adding my interpretations. I listed them out slowly. My friends had left town. They had sent me warnings to stop looking for them. The police were investigating something financial. None of my friends had actually threatened me or hurt me. Connie pointed out that the notes seemed more protective than scary when I read them that way. She said, catastrophic thinking was making me imagine threats that might not exist. Before I left, she taught me a breathing technique for when my heart started racing. I was supposed to breathe in for 4 counts and out for 6 counts and focus on the sensation of air moving through my nose. It seemed too simple to work, but I promised to try it. That night I actually slept for 5 hours straight, which was more than I'd managed in weeks. I still woke up at 3 in the morning and checked my door camera, but at least I'd gotten some rest. The breathing thing helped when I felt panic starting to build in my chest. A few days later, Halima called my cell phone. She asked if I would go on record about the disappearances for an article she was writing about financial fraud schemes that targeted young adults. I told her I couldn't do an interview with my name attached because I didn't want to make things worse for my friends. She said she understood and asked if I would share my timeline with all the identifying details removed. I agreed to that and sent her a document with dates and events, but no names or specific locations. She thanked me and said the article would run in about 2 weeks. The tenants' union sent me an email that same week saying they had mailed a formal notice to my landlord. The notice said Al had to give me 24 hours of written notice before entering my apartment for any reason. It also demanded proof that he had proper key control and wasn't giving copies to unauthorized people. 3 days later, I got a letter from a law office downtown saying they represented Al and he would comply with all housing regulations going forward. It felt like a small victory, even though it didn't solve the bigger problems in my life. I decided to go back to the bar one evening because sitting in my apartment was making me feel worse. The bartender recognized me right away and poured me a soda without me asking. He set it down in front of me and asked gently how I was doing. His kindness was so unexpected that I felt tears start to form in my eyes. I told him I was hanging in there and he said the first drink was on the house. We didn't talk about my missing friends or what had happened. He just treated me like a normal customer, and that simple interaction made me feel more human than I had in weeks. When I got home that night, I had a message on my phone from someone I barely knew. She said she was friends with someone who used to hang out with our group sometimes. She had heard I was looking for information about the cabin trip that happened a few months ago. I called her back immediately, and she told me a recruiter had shown up at the cabin on the second day. He had given a presentation about making easy money through bank account referrals and sign-up bonuses. A bunch of people had signed up for his program right there at the cabin. She hadn't participated herself, which was why she still felt comfortable talking to me. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started searching through my email inbox. I found promotional messages from banks I had never heard of or used. Each one had a referral code attached, and when I traced the codes back through our old group chat, I saw they all came from the same contact. The pieces were finally starting to make sense in a way that made my stomach hurt. My friends had gotten involved in some kind of financial scheme, and now they were dealing with the legal consequences. 2 days later, Detective Beck called my cell. He said he had a general update for me but couldn't share specific details about the ongoing investigation. He confirmed that some members of my friend group had retained attorneys and were cooperating with investigators. Then he asked me again to stop trying to reach out to any of them directly. He explained that continued contact could be seen as witness tampering, even if that wasn't my intention. I promised him I would stop, and I meant it this time because I finally understood that my searching was only making things harder for everyone involved. My next therapy session with Connie happened 2 days later, and I walked in feeling exhausted but calmer than before. She noticed right away and asked what had changed since our last meeting. I told her about Detective Beck's briefing and how finally understanding the situation made everything feel less scary, even though I still felt angry and hurt. Connie nodded and said that made sense because my brain had been filling in the unknown spaces with worst-case situations. She asked me to think about all the threats I had been imagining over the past few weeks, and I listed them out loud. Someone breaking into my apartment to hurt me, my friends being held against their will somewhere, a criminal organization tracking my every move. Connie wrote them down on her notepad and then asked me what evidence I actually had for any of those threats. I sat there staring at the list and realized I had no real proof of any of it. The notes had been warnings to protect me, not threats to harm me. My friends had left because of legal trouble, not because they were in danger. My landlord was just a jerk who broke housing rules, not part of some big plan. Connie gave me homework before I left that day. She told me to plan out 1 full week of my life, as if everything was normal and nothing bad was happening. Write down what I would do each day, who I would see, what activities I would enjoy. She said I needed to practice imagining a future that felt safe and possible instead of constantly preparing for disaster. I took the assignment sheet from her and folded it into my pocket. The next morning at work, a co-worker named Amy stopped by my desk with 2 coffee cups in her hands. She asked if I wanted to grab a break with her, and I almost said no out of habit. But I remembered Connie's homework about acting like things were normal, so I took one of the cups and followed her to the break room. We sat at the small table by the window, and Amy talked about a show she was watching and asked if I had any weekend plans. I kept my answers short and general because I did not want to explain everything that had been happening. She did not push for details and just kept the conversation light and easy. We talked about work projects and the weather and a new restaurant that opened downtown. After 20 minutes, we went back to our desks, and I realized it was the first normal conversation I had experienced in over a month. It felt good to talk about regular things instead of constantly thinking about my missing friends and the investigation. When I got home that evening, there was a certified mail notice stuck to my door. I walked to the post office the next day during lunch and signed for a thick envelope from a law office downtown. Inside was a formal letter from Al's attorney acknowledging the tenants' union complaint. The letter said Al would provide 24 hours of written notice before entering my apartment for any reason going forward. It also included copies of new key control procedures showing that only Al and the building maintenance supervisor had access to master keys. There was a liability waiver they wanted me to sign, but I decided to run it past the tenants' union first before agreeing to anything. Still, seeing everything in writing made me feel less powerless than I had in weeks. It was a small win in the middle of everything else falling apart, but it meant something. Late that night, I could not sleep, so I got up and pulled out every piece of paper and photo I had collected over the past few weeks. I found an empty binder in my closet and started organizing everything into sections. Timeline of disappearances with dates and times, photos of the notes that had appeared in my apartment, screenshots of the door camera footage showing Al's contractor entering without permission, email threads with Detective Beck and the tenants' union, bank referral messages from the group chat. I worked for 3 hours putting it all together in order until the binder was full and every page was labeled. Then I opened my laptop and wrote a letter to myself at the front of the binder. I summarized everything I knew for certain. My friends had gotten involved in some kind of bank bonus scheme. They were now dealing with legal problems. They had excluded me from their activities, which is why I was not in trouble. I would probably never get full explanations or closure. I accepted that some questions would stay unanswered forever. I printed the letter and slid it into the front pocket of the binder. Then I closed it and put it on my bookshelf. It felt like drawing a line under everything that had happened. My phone buzzed the next afternoon with a text from Halima. Her message said the article about bonus mule scams was running in tomorrow's paper. She thanked me again for sharing my timeline and said she had kept all identifying details out of the piece. The article would cover the general scheme and how recruiters target friend groups at social events. I texted back telling her I appreciated her keeping my information private. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and pulled up the Federal Fraud Hotline website. I had been thinking about this for days. I opened our old group chat and found the messages from the recruiter who had pitched the bank bonus program at the cabin. I copied his screen name and phone number. Then I filled out the anonymous tip form on the federal website and pasted in all the information I had. I included dates and details about the cabin trip and the escape room party. I submitted the form and closed my laptop. It felt like the last thing I could do to help without getting in the way of the actual investigation. That night, I got into bed around 10 and turned off the lights. I expected to lie awake for hours like I had been doing for weeks, but my body felt heavy and tired in a different way than before. I was not lying there tense and waiting for footsteps or checking my phone every few minutes. I just felt exhausted and ready to rest. I closed my eyes, and the next thing I knew, sunlight was coming through my window. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It was 7 in the morning. I had slept for 9 hours straight without waking up once. My body had finally decided I was safe enough to stop being on guard all the time. The following week, I went back to the bar on a Tuesday evening. The bartender saw me walk in and smiled while pouring me a soda without asking. He set it down in front of me and asked how I was doing these days. I told him honestly that I was doing better. The panic attacks were happening less often. I was eating 3 meals a day again. I was sleeping through most nights. He said he was glad to hear it and that he had been worried about me. We talked for a few minutes about normal things like sports and weather. Then he moved down the bar to help other customers, and I sat there sipping my drink and feeling almost normal for the first time in forever. Detective Beck called my cell phone 2 days later while I was walking home from work. He said he had another general update for me, but could not share specific details about the ongoing investigation. Several people from my friend group had hired lawyers and were working with prosecutors now. Some of them were cooperating as witnesses. Others might face charges depending on how deep their involvement went. Beck said the important thing for me to know was that I was documented everywhere as a non-participant in whatever had happened. My name appeared in the files only as someone the group had deliberately kept out of their activities. He told me that was actually going to protect me if anyone ever had questions about my connection to the case. I thanked him for the update, and he said to call if I ever needed anything else. My next therapy session with Connie focused on something she called grieving the friendships. She said I needed to accept that these relationships were over, even though I did not get the closure or explanations I wanted. We talked about how grief is not just for when people die, but also for when relationships end in confusing or painful ways. Connie asked me what rituals might help me let go of the friendships while honoring the good parts that had been real. I thought about it for a while. Maybe I could write letters to each person that I never sent, or go through old photos and pick out a few good memories to keep while deleting the rest, or donate the stuff they had left at my apartment instead of holding on to it forever. Connie said all of those ideas sounded healthy and asked me to pick one to try before our next session. I left her office feeling sad, but also lighter somehow, like I had permission to stop waiting for my old life to come back. The next week at work, my coworker stopped by my desk during lunch and asked if I wanted help looking for apartments. I stared at her because I had mentioned my lease situation maybe once in passing weeks ago and did not think anyone had been paying attention. She said she knew the area pretty well and had friends who were landlords if I wanted references for decent places. I felt something loosen in my chest and told her yes. We spent our lunch break looking at listings on her laptop, and she pointed out which neighborhoods had good bus routes and which landlords she had heard complaints about. By the time we went back to our desks, I had a list of 5 places to check out and her offer to come with me to tours if I wanted company. It felt strange to accept help, but also good in a way I had forgotten was possible. 2 days later, the tenants' union investigator called saying she had finished reviewing my complaint against Al. She confirmed he had violated multiple housing codes, including illegal entry and harassment through improper showing demands. The union was prepared to help me recover my full security deposit, plus a rent credit for the violations, if I wanted to pursue it. I said yes to both without hesitation, because Al did not deserve to keep any of my money after what he put me through. She told me the paperwork would take a few weeks, but that she was confident we had a strong case. I thanked her and hung up, feeling like I had won something small but important. That evening, Halima sent me a text saying her article about bonus mule schemes had generated significant response. Other people were coming forward with similar stories about recruitment at social events and friend groups getting pulled into fraud without understanding the legal risks. She said my timeline had helped her connect patterns across multiple cases, and that knowing my story was helping others made a real difference. I read her message 3 times and felt something unfamiliar that I finally recognized as purpose. My experience had been terrible, but at least it was not completely pointless if it helped someone else avoid the same trap. I started packing non-essential items that weekend. I pulled boxes from my closet and began sorting through books and kitchen stuff I barely used. When I got to the shelf with photos from group trips and inside jokes, I paused for a long time. I picked up a framed picture from the cabin trip I had skipped and looked at everyone's faces smiling at the camera. They had looked so happy and normal, and I wondered if they already knew about the scheme by then, or if they were still just having fun. I wrapped the frame in newspaper and put it in a donation box instead of packing it for my new place. Each item I sealed away felt like progress toward a future that was not defined by what I lost. The coffee mugs Clare had left at my place went in the donation box. The concert poster Jackson had given me went in the trash. The board game we always played at Eva's place got packed because I still liked the game, even if I could not play it with them anymore. By Sunday evening, I had filled 4 boxes for donation and 3 for my move, and my apartment felt lighter somehow. The following morning, my boss called me into her office, and I braced myself for bad news. Instead, she told me my work performance had improved enough to remove me from the improvement plan. I was still part-time, but she said the flexible schedule actually seemed to be working better for my productivity and mental health. She asked if I wanted to continue with the current arrangement or transition back to full-time eventually. I chose to stay part-time without even thinking about it, because the flexibility had given me space to go to therapy and handle everything else without falling apart. She smiled and said that was fine, and that she was glad to see me doing better. I left her office feeling like I had cleared another hurdle I had not realized I was still jumping. 3 days after that, Detective Beck called asking me to come to the station for what he called a closing briefing. My stomach dropped, but I agreed to come in that afternoon. At the station, he led me to the same interview room as before and spread out a folder on the table between us. He confirmed that federal charges had been filed against the recruiter who organized the scheme. The person operated out of an adjacent state and had been targeting friend groups and social networks across multiple cities for over 2 years. Beck said the investigation had involved coordination between multiple agencies and that the case was solid. I asked what that meant for my friends, and he said that was what he wanted to explain. Beck told me several people from my friend group were cooperating as witnesses because they had been recruited victims rather than organizers. They had been pulled into the scheme through social pressure and promises of easy money without fully understanding they were committing fraud. Other people in the group faced potential charges for knowingly participating and recruiting others after they understood what they were doing. He would not tell me specific names or who fell into which category, but said the distinction mattered a lot for how prosecutors were handling each case. I sat there trying to process that some of my friends might go to jail while others might just have to testify. Beck slid several pages across the table showing account opening records and referral networks. He pointed to documentation proving I was never involved in any account openings or referral schemes. My name appeared in the files only as someone the group deliberately excluded from their activities. There were even text messages between group members discussing how to keep me out of it because I would ask too many questions or report it. Beck said this documentation would protect me if anyone ever had questions about my connection to the case. I stared at the proof that my friends had intentionally left me out and felt a weird mix of relief and hurt that I could not quite name. Beck's expression got serious, and he asked me to stop trying to contact any of them because ongoing communication could be interpreted as witness tampering, even if that was not my intention. Anyone cooperating with prosecutors had to limit their contact with other people connected to the case. I told him I understood and that I would stop looking for answers. He nodded and said that was probably healthier for me anyway, because the legal process would take months, and I needed to focus on moving forward with my own life. I left the station with copies of the documentation and drove straight home feeling exhausted in a deep way that had nothing to do with being tired. In therapy, 2 days later, I told Connie about the briefing and everything Beck had explained. She listened carefully and then helped me work through the grief of losing friendships that had been real, even though they ended in lies and legal trouble. Connie said it was possible to acknowledge that the good times mattered, while also accepting that those relationships were over and that I might never get the closure or explanations I wanted. We talked about how some of my friends had made terrible choices, but that did not erase years of genuine friendship before everything went wrong. She asked what would help me process this complicated grief, and I said I did not know. Connie suggested we plan coping strategies for triggers, like unknown phone numbers and unexpected notes, since those had caused so much anxiety before. We spent the rest of the session practicing grounding techniques and making a list of people I could call if I felt panicked. By the time I left, I had a written plan for handling moments when the past tried to pull me back into fear. The next day, I started looking at apartments online during my lunch break at work. I filtered by neighborhoods I'd never lived in before because I wanted somewhere that didn't have memories attached to every corner. A one-bedroom came up in a quiet area about 20 minutes from my office with hardwood floors and big windows. The landlord answered my inquiry within an hour and offered to show it that evening. I drove over after work, and the building looked solid and well-maintained with security cameras in the lobby and proper lighting in the parking lot. The landlord met me at the unit and walked me through everything while explaining the lease terms clearly. She showed me the maintenance request system and the proper notice requirements for entry, which were all spelled out in writing. I asked about the lock situation, and she said I could install my own deadbolt as long as I provided her a key and restored the original hardware when I moved out. The rent was slightly higher than my current place, but worth it for the peace of mind. I filled out the application right there and put down the deposit that night. She called 2 days later to say I was approved, and we scheduled the lease signing for the following week. At work, I mentioned to my coworker that I'd found a new place and was moving in 3 weeks. She offered to help me move on Saturday, and I accepted immediately because I didn't have many other options. The weekend before the move, I started packing systematically and labeling every box with contents and destination room. I donated bags of stuff to charity because I wanted to start fresh without dragging unnecessary things into my new space. My coworker showed up Saturday morning in her truck with moving blankets and tie-down straps already loaded. We worked efficiently for 4 hours loading furniture and boxes, while she kept the mood light with stories about her own terrible moving experiences. By early afternoon, we had everything unloaded at the new apartment, and she suggested ordering pizza. We sat on my couch eating pepperoni slices straight from the box and talking about normal things like weekend plans and a show we both watched. It felt easy and casual without any pressure or complicated history weighing everything down. She left around 5, and I spent the rest of the evening unpacking essentials and setting up my bedroom. That first night in the new place, I noticed the quiet felt different from before. It wasn't ominous or threatening, just neutral background silence. I installed new locks on the front door immediately and tested them 5 times to make sure they worked properly. Before bed, I checked all the windows and made sure the door camera was positioned correctly and recording. I still felt some anxiety, but it was manageable rather than overwhelming. I slept through the night without waking up to check the camera feed. A week later, I found mail forwarded through Beck's office sitting in my mailbox. The return address had no name, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a single-page letter from Claire with no date or location information. She wrote a brief apology without explaining any details or asking for forgiveness. She said she hoped I could move forward and that she was sorry for everything that happened. The letter felt incomplete and unsatisfying, but I understood she probably couldn't say more because of legal restrictions. I sat at my kitchen table holding the paper and feeling a complicated mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. Part of me wanted to respond and demand real answers, but I knew that wouldn't help anything. I opened my documentation binder where I kept all the notes and timelines and camera footage from the past months. I placed Claire's letter in the front pocket and closed the binder firmly. It felt symbolic somehow, like I was choosing to end that chapter rather than letting it drag on indefinitely. I put the binder on a high shelf in my closet where I wouldn't see it every day, but could access it if needed. 2 weeks after moving, I got an email from Al demanding I pay for carpet cleaning and minor wall repairs before he'd return my security deposit. I forwarded the email to the tenants' union advocate who had helped me before. She responded within hours, saying those charges were not legitimate under the lease terms and that she would handle it directly. Over the next 2 weeks, she exchanged several messages with Al and eventually sent him a formal demand letter. I received a check for my full security deposit plus the rent credit the housing authority had ordered within 3 days of that letter. It felt like a small victory that someone had actually held him accountable for breaking the rules. In therapy that week, Connie and I reviewed how far I'd come since that night when footsteps stopped outside my door. I still had anxiety, and probably always would, but I'd developed healthy coping skills and realistic expectations about what I could control. She asked how I felt about the progress, and I said I felt stable in a way I hadn't before everything happened. We talked about maintaining the coping strategies even when things felt calm, because that's when people often let their guard down. Connie reminded me that setbacks were normal and didn't erase the progress I'd made. My new neighborhood had a coffee shop 3 blocks from my apartment that I started visiting most mornings. The barista was a college student who worked the early shift, and after a week, she started making my order without me asking. I appreciated the small routine and the way she'd nod when I walked in like we had an understanding. Sometimes I'd sit at the window counter and watch people walk by while drinking my coffee. It felt like normal life in a way I'd forgotten was possible. One morning while I was there, I got an email from Detective Beck with the subject line closing my involvement in the case. He wrote that the investigation had concluded with several plea agreements and that I would not need to provide any further statements. He included a contact number if I was ever subpoenaed for testimony, but said it was unlikely given my documented non-participant status. The email felt final in a good way, like official confirmation that this chapter was actually over. At work the following week, my boss called me into her office, and I felt my stomach drop thinking I was getting fired. Instead, she offered me a permanent part-time position with full benefits starting next month. She said my productivity had actually increased with the flexible schedule, and the company wanted to keep me long-term. I accepted immediately and felt relief wash over me because financial stability had been a constant worry. Walking back to my desk, I realized I'd just secured housing, resolved the legal situation, and gotten job security all within a few weeks. Things were actually working out in concrete, measurable ways. The next week, I was picking up groceries when I ran into someone I vaguely recognized from one of Jackson's birthday parties a few years back. She waved and asked how I was doing, and I paused for a second before answering honestly that I was okay and moving forward. She nodded like she understood more than she was saying and told me she was glad to hear it before moving on down the aisle. The exchange lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt significant because I'd given a real answer instead of deflecting or panicking. I finished my shopping and drove home feeling steady, rather than anxious about the brief interaction. That evening, I got an email notification that Halima had published a follow-up piece about financial fraud schemes and their impact on social networks. I opened the article on my laptop and read through her analysis of how these scams damage relationships beyond just the legal consequences. She quoted several anonymous sources, and I recognized parts of my own timeline woven into the broader narrative about trust and betrayal. The piece was careful and well-researched, without sensationalizing anyone's situation. I sent Halima a brief thank you email for handling the story with respect, and she responded within an hour, saying she hoped it helped other people recognize warning signs earlier than my group had. Reading the article made me feel less alone in what had happened, even though I knew my specific circumstances were unusual. During my next therapy session, I told Connie I felt ready to try expanding my social circle slowly and carefully. She pulled out a notepad, and we spent 20 minutes identifying low-pressure activities where I could meet people without the intensity of my old friend group. She suggested things like hobby groups, volunteer opportunities, and casual sports leagues, where the focus was on the activity rather than deep personal connections. We made a list of 3 options I could research, and I promised to follow up on at least one before our next session. Connie reminded me that building new friendships would take time and that I shouldn't expect immediate closeness with anyone. I appreciated her realistic approach because it helped me set reasonable expectations instead of putting pressure on myself to replace what I'd lost. The following week, I found a casual running group that met twice a week at a local park. I showed up on Thursday evening feeling nervous, but the structure was loose and welcoming. People ran at their own pace and regrouped every 15 minutes to make sure no one got left behind. The conversation stayed light and focused on running routes, upcoming races, and general small talk about work and weather. Nobody asked probing personal questions or tried to make plans beyond the scheduled runs. I left after an hour feeling tired but good about having participated in something normal and social. At work the next day, my coworker asked if I wanted to come to a game night at their friend's apartment that weekend. I hesitated because the idea of meeting new people in a more intimate setting made me anxious, but I said yes anyway. Saturday evening, I drove to an apartment complex across town and knocked on the door with sweaty palms. The group was friendly and focused on playing board games rather than getting to know each other deeply. I stayed for 2 hours and left when I started feeling overwhelmed by the noise and social energy. In the car, I sat for a few minutes processing the evening and realized it felt like progress, rather than failure, that I'd gone at all and stayed as long as I did. 3 months after moving into my new apartment, I was reviewing my door camera footage one morning and realized I hadn't been checking it obsessively in weeks. I still looked at the recordings occasionally, but it had become routine maintenance rather than panic-driven surveillance. The shift felt significant because it meant my baseline anxiety had decreased enough that I wasn't constantly expecting threats. I made a mental note to mention it to Connie at our next session as evidence of progress. That afternoon, Detective Beck called one final time with an update about the case. He told me the recruiter had taken a plea deal, and several of the cooperating witnesses, including some of my former friends, had received probation instead of jail time. Beck confirmed that none of them would face prison sentences given their cooperation, and the fact that most were recruited victims rather than organizers. I asked him directly if any of them might reach out now that the legal situation was resolved. Beck said it was possible but unlikely, given the shame and the legal restrictions on contact between cooperating witnesses. I thanked him for the information and realized as I hung up that I was genuinely okay with that answer. The idea of hearing from any of them didn't fill me with the desperate need for closure it once had. During my next scheduled therapy session, Connie suggested we move to monthly check-ins rather than weekly appointments. She explained that I'd developed strong coping skills and a support network that could sustain me between sessions. Connie said she'd remain available if I needed emergency support, but that she thought I was ready for less frequent contact. I agreed to the monthly schedule and felt proud rather than abandoned by the change. The work I'd done over the past several months had brought me to a place where I could handle setbacks without spiraling into panic. I left her office that day feeling capable and grounded in ways I hadn't been since before everyone disappeared. I pulled out my journal that night and sat at my kitchen table with a pen. The blank page stared back at me for a minute before I started writing about how the friendships had been real, even if they ended in lies. I wrote about game nights and road trips and inside jokes that used to make me laugh until I cried. Those memories mattered because they happened, because for a while I had people who showed up and made plans and texted me random stuff during the day. The fact that they got involved in something illegal and then ghosted me didn't erase the years before that. I wrote that I could acknowledge the good parts without pretending the ending was okay or that what they did was acceptable. They made choices that hurt me, and I didn't have to forgive that just because I missed them sometimes. I filled 3 pages before my hand cramped, and I felt like I'd said what I needed to say. I closed the journal and put it back on the shelf next to my therapy workbook. Later that night, I locked my door with hands that didn't shake anymore. I tested the deadbolt twice out of habit rather than panic. I turned off the kitchen light and then the living room lamp and walked to my bedroom in the dark without jumping at shadows. My phone sat on the nightstand with tomorrow's calendar pulled up, showing work meetings in the morning, running group at 6 and coffee with my coworker after. My heartbeat stayed steady and calm as I reviewed each item. The future felt manageable now, built on realistic expectations instead of the fantasy that 14 people would stay in my life forever. I was okay with that. I was okay, period. That was enough. So yeah, that's basically it. Nothing dramatic, just life doing its weird little thing again. Thanks for hanging out with me. It always feels good to just talk. Come back next time if you feel like it.